This podcast is intended to be educational and give a very basic overview of some popular films and television shows that attempt to depict the transgender experience. The transgender representation that is shown in the few films and TV shows I discuss is not a complete picture of what trans representation has looked like in the past or what it looks like now. There are many more films and TV shows out there that I do not discuss. I encourage you to explore these for yourself. Transgender representation. It's something we hear about all the time. But what does it mean when it comes to types of media like film and television? I'm currently a first-year student studying film in New York City. One day, I'd like to make films that are truly representative of the transgender experience, because those are important stories that should be told, and they aren't told accurately enough in mainstream media. However, when I started thinking about how I could tell a story that was truly representative through film, I hit a roadblock. I didn't have much prior knowledge to work with. I knew that accurate trans representation was lacking in TV and in film, and that when a transgender character did show up, they were almost always diminished in some way. But how did that happen, and what other films and TV shows were out there that had tried to tell transgender stories? I decided I had to do more research on this, and I came up with the questions: what does transgender representation look like in the past in film and on TV? What does transgender representation look like in film and on TV today? And even though there is more transgender representation in the film and TV industries than ever before, do transgender people feel that they're being represented accurately enough? Let's start with just film for now. So, what does transgender representation look like in the past in film? Let's go back to 1970. In 1970, the Christine Jorgensen story was released. It was based on Jorgensen's autobiography, a personal autobiography, where she talks about her experience finding out that she is a transgender woman. She was previously known as George Jorgensen before flying to Denmark to undergo a sex reassignment surgery. This was one of the first films ever about the transgender experience. Sadly, the way she was portrayed in the film reduces her story to a parody of transsexual identity, as Evelyn Deschênes puts it. In her dissertation, Wish You Were Here, representing trans road narratives in mainstream cinema, she notes on how different Jorgensen's journey is portrayed in her autobiography than in the film based on it, saying, Christine Jorgensen opens her 1967 A Personal Autobiography with the story of her grandfather's immigration to the United States from Denmark. Her narrative as a trans memoir must also start with a look back toward her childhood, in order to disrupt the audience's possible assumptions of her birth gender. In order to represent Jorgensen's gender realization on film, however, Irving Rappaport must take the memory of her understanding her gender identity and represent it in the space art of the film reel. In other words, the story cannot start backwards like it does in a memoir, because two ideas of time are happening at once through her words and narration. The story on the screen must start at the beginning of the story and establish that difference visually and spatially right away. In this example, Jorgensen's story must then begin in childhood and start with dysphoria, rather than the magic or make-believe of two simultaneous timelines. This shows how it's difficult to represent the stories of trans people accurately, in part because when they are told through film and the perspective of the camera, there is a disconnect between the audience and the main character that wouldn't be there if the same story was to be told in written form. Seeing a story from a third-person perspective invites the audience to make their own judgments about what they are seeing, making it hard for them to let go of their preconceived notions about trans people. Instead, they apply them to what they are seeing, making many films about the trans experience seem stereotypical. By changing the form of Jorgensen's story from autobiography to film, it erases part of her perspective because the audience sees her story from a third-person perspective rather than a first-person perspective, so we never truly get to see her experience from her point of view on screen. Deschênes also comments on how the way the story was filmed encouraged audiences to sexualize transgender people and see them as passive objects, writing Let Me Die a Woman, along with other trans films from the 1970s like I Want What I Want, The Christine Jorgensen Story, and Myra Breckinridge, solidified the filmmaking techniques surrounding the transsexual body. Graphic images or details of surgery, a mise-en-scène that displays the trans person's pre- or post-op genitals, excessive montages and or shots on cross-dressing, and close-up facial shots framing the trans person's emotional confessional shots. These popular films could have represented a community of people, but instead they became a schlocky, tropey, cliched-filled smattering of representations, which solely seem to focus on the transsexual body as sexual object. The medical gaze is also prominent in this film, because the audience only sees Jorgensen as herself after she undergoes the surgery, making only the doctor's narrative seem authentic. It reduces her to only a subject for the doctor to operate on. In 1999, the film Boys Don't Cry was released. It featured Hilary Swank, a cisgender actress who played Brandon Tina, a transgender man who was a real person that was raped and murdered. This film was monumental for transgender representation in film because it was the first mainstream film about a transgender man. However, there was also some controversy. After the film was released, some transgender activists felt that Swank playing Tina's role as a cisgender actress took away from the film's message to the general public about transgender people. She would be a man on screen, but on the red carpet at the Academy Awards ceremony where she won an award for playing Tina, she would be a woman, leading trans activists to opine that this gives off the message that trans men are simply women dressing up as men. There were also some people that felt that the film diminished transgender people by giving the impression that transgender people can only be victims. It's important to note that this is based off a true story. The horrors of what Brandon Tina went through shouldn't stay in the dark, and the public should be made aware of the violence that transgender people face. On the other hand, this was one of the first mainstream movies featuring a transgender person, and unfortunately, because of what the film contained, it caused a trend where transgender people were only depicted as victims in future films and television shows. I'll be going more in depth about that later. So, what does transgender representation look like in film today? Let's fast forward to 2015. In 2015, The Danish Girl was released, featuring Eddie Redmayne, who plays Lily Elba, a transgender woman from Denmark who transitioned in the late 1920s. She was the first recorded person to undergo a sex reassignment surgery. She unfortunately died from complications from surgery. The issue with The Danish Girl is that even though it aims to tell Lily Elba's story, it objectifies her under the gaze of the doctor. Sex reassignment surgery was a very new concept in those times, and rather than seeing her as a person, the doctor sees her as an opportunity to do what no doctor has ever done before and change her sex through surgery. There is a scene where the doctor tells Lily about a patient he had who had been dealing with gender dysphoria like her that had run away the morning they were supposed to undergo the surgery. She immediately says that she would never run away. Her eagerness paints her as the perfect subject and not a person. This exchange between the doctor and Lily feels unnecessary. Her needing to prove herself as the perfect subject to the doctor in order to receive the surgery she needs, as well as the film's perpetuation of the medical gaze in trans stories, like in the Christine Jorgensen story, is what causes many members of the transgender community to reject it. There's also the fact that Eddie Redmayne is a cisgender man playing a transgender woman. I wanted to do some more research on why it wasn't common for transgender characters to be played by transgender people, and found an article by Extra, a magazine that writes about LGBTQ2S+ politics, culture, and health. It discusses how some actors could be transgender but don't want to out themselves for fear that they will lose job opportunities. This reveals part of the reason why transgender representation is lacking in the TV and film industries. It also reveals that it's more common for cisgender actors to play transgender characters instead of transgender actors playing transgender characters because it's easier to get greenlit in terms of funding and distribution so that the film or TV show will do well. So, transgender representation in films made both today and in the past was negatively affected by how the characters were filmed, how they were casted, and how they and their stories were presented through the lens of the medical gaze, ultimately objectifying them. I was correct when I said that accurate transgender representation was lacking in film at the very beginning, but now I know why. Let's move on to television now, and answer the question, what has transgender representation looked like in the past in television? In 2000, the popular forensics crime drama television series CSI began to be broadcasted on television. Throughout the series, there were multiple episodes where transgender people were murdered. In the episode Chicha Changes, a transgender woman is found dead in her car on the side of the road. Additionally, the character Paul Millender, who is a transgender man, is depicted as a serial killer who escapes from custody when he is arrested, kills his mother, and then commits suicide. There are a few episodes in the series where there are transgender characters, and unfortunately, they continue the popular tropes of the transgender person being the villain or the victim. The way CSI showed trans individuals as murder victims, when transgender people are one of the populations that are at the most risk for being murdered, is insulting, making it seem like they can only be victims, alienating them from cisgender people, and teaching audiences misleading narratives about them. Moving forward in time, a TV series I found that made transgender representation history was Orange is the New Black. One of the characters, Sophia Bursett, was a black transgender woman being played by a black transgender actress, Laverne Cox. This was revolutionary because, for the most part, transgender characters in film and TV had been white and had been played by cisgender actors. In a thesis written by Kat Newman that examines and analyzes transgender characters and how they are depicted in television series and films released after 2012, Newman talks about how, while this made history, Sophia Bursett went from being one of the main characters on the show to barely having 5 minutes of screen time in the final season. When she was on screen, she faced microaggressions, violence, and misgendering from the other inmates, and was mistreated by the prison itself, the guards, and the warden. She was eventually placed in solitary confinement, quote unquote, for her own safety. Newman argues that these events in Burse's story fail to make Orange is the New Black an exemplary form of trans representation, saying, although these experiences may speak to the precarious circumstances of incarcerated black trans people, Bursa is also limited to only these experiences. She is never Sophia, a woman, and is always Sophia, the transgender woman. Even though there is an obvious need for more authentic trans representation in television, it's important to acknowledge that statistically, we've actually come a long way. A report called Where We Are on TV by GLAAD found that from 2015 to 2016, there were no transgender characters on primetime broadcast programming, and there were only 3 recurring transgender characters on cable, showing us how transgender representation in terms of characters was really lacking only a few years ago. In contrast, the same report done from 2021 to 2022 found that 42 recurring transgender characters were counted on broadcast, cable, and streaming networks, appearing in dramas and comedies. This is a significant amount of growth compared to the previous report, showing how the television industry is becoming more inclusive and probably will continue to be in the future. I was curious to see what transgender people thought about the transgender representation in film and TV, so to answer my final question, even though there is more transgender representation in the film and TV industries than ever before, do transgender people feel that they're being represented accurately? I interviewed a transgender friend of mine.
Question number 1. What are some transgender actors or actresses that you've heard of?
Ooh, I'm really bad at names, but that one actor from Umbrella Academy who played Victor, I think his name is. The person who played Double Trouble in She-Ra, they're non-binary. Oh, the actor from Heartstopper, it's a trans woman. I haven't fully watched Heartstopper, but I know she's there, and I don't know her name.
Question number 2. Have you heard of any films or TV shows featuring transgender characters? Like, can you name them?
She-Ra, like I mentioned, but it's a very background character. Heartstopper, Umbrella Academy, obviously. I think Steven Universe technically counts. To say like, oh, trans. Yeah, I think that's all I have. There's probably more. I just can't name it.
If you had to make a prediction about the number of transgender characters that are in film or TV shows right now, what would you say? Like, what would you guess?
I'd say 20.
Is there any reason why you like guess that particular number?
Um, media is becoming woke. In all seriousness, media has been more like has been representing like trans folk a lot more, and it's not unheard of. Is it more like implied things and to say like, oh, they're trans, but we don't say it in the show, but that's okay. You don't really need to, as long as they are. All of this is also in the lens of like, I'm trans and I actively seek out things that are trans, so yeah.
Okay, so if a film or TV show depicted a transgender character, how would you think they would be depicted?
Um, it's a mixed bag. It's either they mentioned it or it can range from similar to like race and stuff, to completely not mentioning it and like going like, oh, they're trans by the way, and just like they're just a normal character, which is fine, but it's also nice to just say, hey, I'm trans. And it can also range from that's horrible, why would you have that, to like a trans guy is just basically a woman that is just like, yeah, by the way, I'm trans, or like a quote unquote like ugly woman is trans because, oh, I have a beard and like I don't want to pass it anyway, but I have long hair and I do makeup, so that makes me trans. And it's just like it's a mixed bag. So to answer that question, 50-50 if it's good.
How do you feel about the current amount of transgender representation in film and TV right now? Like, do you feel like you're being represented well enough? Do you feel like you're being represented accurately? Is there more you'd like to see of something?
It's like fine. It's definitely not to the same extent of gay men or lesbians. I find lesbians are much more represented just because they tend to be, at least people companies see them as like safer. But trans folk in general is such like it's so wide reaching, and actually having that like more people, showing up and like being like, hey, I'm trans or something, is I feel like it'll be rare for at least this maybe decade. I would say not, it's not rare, but it's definitely not common to make it be common. I don't know if it'll actually happen. I think it will eventually, probably in my lifetime, but when I'm like, I don't know, 30. And it actually being good is also a mixed bag because I feel represented of like the casual mention of it. It's not a main focus, and it's not like almost damaging like how a lot of like black folk are kind of tired of like having representation through, oh, I'm suffering because I'm black. It's the same thing of, oh, I'm suffering because I'm trans and this is the representation I'm gonna get. I'd much more rather like have a casual scene of just like, no, I can't go to that bathroom right now, and then the person goes, why? I'm trans. Oh, okay, we'll find you another bathroom. Something like that.
There's still definitely a lot to be desired from both the film and television industries in terms of trans representation. The good news is, we've come a long way from the films that had a major role in forming the stereotypes that still affect how transgender people are seen by the majority cisgender public today. It's important that we tell authentic transgender stories to prove these stereotypes wrong, because it really is the media we consume that dictates how we see and think of others. Thanks for listening.